She was only 9 years old, and she was crying. Not the kind of crying that children do when they scrape a knee or lose a toy. This was the other kind, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't make a sound, where the tears just fall and the child doesn't even bother wiping them away, because somewhere deep inside, she already knows that crying won't fix what just happened. Princess Charlotte stood near the end of a long corridor in one of the royal residences, her small shoulders tight, to her eyes red, her hands clasped in front of her the way children do when they're trying very hard to hold themselves together in a place where falling apart is simply not allowed. Around her, staff moved quietly. No one stopped. No one knelt down. No one asked what was wrong. That is the first thing you need to understand about Charlotte's world. Emotions are managed. Appearances are maintained. And little girls, even royal ones, especially royal ones, learn very early that there are spaces where their feelings have no room. But something had happened that day. Something that even the practiced calm of palace life could not smooth over quickly enough. It had started, as many things do in the British royal family, with an ordinary moment that was never really ordinary at all. Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen Camilla, so wife of King Charles III, had arrived with her son Tom Parker Bowles for what was described as a family gathering. These events happen. They are scheduled and managed and photographed when appropriate. The blended nature of the royal family, the merging of Charles's children with Camilla's, has always been a carefully curated project. Warm images, polite interactions, the machinery of public relations working overtime to present something that looks, from the outside, like harmony. Tom Parker Bowles is not a figure who attracts much royal controversy on the surface. He is a food writer, charming in public, well-connected in London's social circles. He moves through the world with the ease of someone who grew up adjacent to great power without being fully consumed by it. He knows the rooms. He knows the rules. He knows how to behave, which is exactly what made that afternoon so striking. Nobody in the household expected Charlotte to come around that corner when she did. She was supposed to be in another part of the residence entirely, with her brothers, or with a member of staff, or doing whatever 9-year-old princesses do on quiet afternoons when the adults are doing adult things in other rooms. But Charlotte had wandered. Children do. And what she walked into was a conversation that was not meant for her ears. And the details of what was said remain private in the way that all genuinely sensitive royal matters remain private. Not because the palace issues a statement saying so, but because the people present simply do not speak. Walls hold secrets in those houses the way stone holds cold. You can feel it without being told. What is known, what sources close to the family have quietly acknowledged, is that Tom said something in that moment that landed on Charlotte the way only truly careless words can land on a child. Not shouted, not cruel in an obvious way. The kind of thing that adults say when they forget, or choose to forget, that a child is within range. A comment, an observation, something about Charlotte, or about her father William, or about the way things work in that family. The real way, and underneath the photographs. And Charlotte heard it. She stood there for a moment, the way children do when the world has just shifted slightly under their feet, and they haven't figured out yet whether to run or stay. Then she turned and walked away, quietly. No scene, no confrontation. Just a 9-year-old girl taking something heavy and carrying it off by herself down a long corridor. The tears came later, in private, but not private enough. A member of staff saw her. Word reached William. And that is where the second part of this story begins, because William's reaction to what he was told was not the reaction of a man receiving new information. It was the reaction of a man who had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, to have a suspicion confirmed. Prince William has always occupied a complicated emotional territory when it comes to Camilla and her family. He was 12 years old when his mother Diana died. He was 17 when his father formally began his public relationship with the woman Diana had described as the third person in her marriage. He stood in cathedrals and palaces and watched the world reshape itself around a version of events he had not chosen and could not stop. He did what he was trained to do. He smiled. He was gracious. He performed the unity that the institution required. But performance is not feeling, and the people who know William truly know him. Well, not the version of him that appears in official photographs, will tell you that beneath the composure, there has always been a fault line. A place where the grief of a boy who lost his mother and the duty of a man who serves an institution have never fully made peace with each other. Camilla, over the years, had worked carefully to build something approaching warmth with William and Harry. There were private dinners, shared jokes, the slow accumulation of ordinary moments that are the only real currency of family trust. And to a significant degree, it had worked. William, publicly at least, acknowledged her place in his father's life. He was respectful. He was present. He did not cause scenes. Tom Parker Bowles was a different matter. Tom exists in that gray zone that complicated families always produce. The stepson who is not a stepson by any legal definition, and the man who grew up in the same orbit of pain and public scrutiny that William did, but from the opposite side of it. Where William lost a mother to the fallout of that marriage, Tom gained proximity to a throne. Their experiences of the same story are not just different, they are, in certain lights, opposed. William had never been close to Tom. Polite, yes. Present when occasion demanded, yes. But close? No. And there had been, over the years, small moments, nothing dramatic, nothing that made headlines, where Tom's manner had registered somewhere in William's internal ledger as something to be noted. The afternoon Charlotte came home with tears on her face and a silence she couldn't explain moved that ledger entry from noted to something considerably more serious. William didn't raise his voice. He didn't call anyone. He didn't issue instructions through press secretaries or summon family members for confrontations. He went very quiet. But in the geography of William's emotional life, quiet is not peace. Quiet is the thing that happens when something has been decided. And something, that afternoon, had been decided. Charlotte, for her part, eventually stopped crying. She ate her dinner. She did her homework. She did what children in extraordinary circumstances learn to do. She continued. But she carried something with her from that corridor, some new understanding of how the world she lived in actually worked, that no amount of careful royal management would fully reach. The hidden truth that William hadn't known, or perhaps had known but never had confirmed, was beginning to surface. And it would not be going back down. William Wales does not forget things. This is one of those facts about him that people who have worked inside royal circles will mention almost in passing, as though it is simply a known feature of the landscape, like saying a particular stretch of coast gets heavy fog. He doesn't forget. He files. He waits. And when the moment comes, if a moment comes, he acts with the kind of precision that looks from the outside like coldness, but is really something else entirely. It is the precision of a man who learned very young that impulsive emotion in public has consequences that last decades. He had watched his parents' impulsive emotions last decades. In the days following Charlotte's tears, William moved through his official schedule without visible disruption. Yet engagements kept, meetings attended, the professional smile deployed exactly as trained. Kate, who misses very little where her children are concerned, had noticed Charlotte's quietness at dinner that first evening and had sat with her quietly in that particular way Kate has, not pressing, not performing comfort, just being physically present until the child decides whether or not to speak. Charlotte eventually spoke. What she told her mother was partial, and children edit instinctively. They protect adults, even when adults don't realize they're being protected. She didn't repeat everything she had heard verbatim, but what she gave Kate was enough. A tone, a reference, a sentence fragment that hung in the air of that bedroom like something that needed handling. Kate brought it to William that night. She did not dramatize it. This is something people misunderstand about Catherine, Princess of Wales. They see the elegance, the poise, as the careful grace of public appearances, and they imagine a woman who performs those qualities at home as well. She does not. At home with William, she is direct, she is precise. She said what Charlotte had told her clearly, and then she stopped talking and let William absorb it. What crossed William's face in that moment was not anger. Not yet. It was recognition. Because here is the thing that William had been navigating for years, and the thing that existed in the space between official family photographs and the truth of private dynamics, Tom Parker Bowles, whatever his public charm, had a habit. Not a dramatic habit, not one that made it onto any front page or into any biography, a habit of the small kind, the kind that operates in rooms where journalists are not present and cameras are not rolling, a habit of saying things, particularly around William's family, that contained a particular edge, a reference here, a comment there. Things that landed just slightly wrong and were easily defensible as jokes if challenged. You know the type. Every extended family has one. The person who operates in the gray zone between wit and cruelty, who reads the room just well enough to calibrate how far they can push, and who has pushed incrementally for long enough that the people around them have built a kind of weary tolerance for it. You stop confronting it because confronting it sounds disproportionate. He was just joking. That's just how he is. You're being too sensitive. William had been too gracious for too long. Charlotte walking into that corridor changed the calculation, because whatever William was willing to absorb as an adult, whatever he had quietly filed away as the price of maintaining a functional blended family for the sake of his father's happiness, none of that applied to his daughter. Charlotte was 9. She had not signed up for the complicated emotional ledger of the Windsor family politics. She had not agreed to absorb the spillover of decades-old resentments dressed up as offhand comments. She was a child eating her dinner and doing her homework and walking down corridors in what should have been the safety of her own home. And she had come home crying. William made a decision. Not to confront Tom publicly, not to involve the palace press office, not to do any of the things that result in headlines and managed statements and the whole exhausting machinery of royal controversy cranking into motion. That was not William's way, and it was not the right way. What he decided was simpler and, in the long run, considerably more powerful. Distance. Managed, deliberate, permanent distance. The kind of distance that doesn't require explanation because it is never announced. Invitations that stop arriving. Gatherings where certain people are present and others are not. The slow, quiet reshaping of a social landscape so that a particular figure simply no longer occupies the same rooms as your children. Camilla was a more complicated question. William's relationship with his stepmother had been, over the years, one of the more quietly remarkable diplomatic achievements of the modern royal family. He had been, by any honest accounting, a gracious and cooperative stepson. He had understood, and on some level, that Camilla made his father happy, and that his father's happiness was not his to withhold. He had performed warmth when warmth was required. He had posed for photographs. He had sat at tables. But there was always, underneath the performance, a thing he had never fully resolved. His mother had told her own story on television to the world about what Camilla's presence in her marriage had cost her. And Diana's voice, its particular tremor when she spoke about certain things, had never fully left William. You don't unlearn the sound of your mother's voice describing her own pain. You carry it. You manage it. You function around it. But it is always there, under the floor, the way the cold is always in old stone. What Charlotte's afternoon had done was not create new resentment. It had simply removed the last layer of management from something William had been managing for a very long time. And the question now was whether Camilla knew what her son had said. Sources suggest she did not know initially. By the time the afternoon had passed and the household had resettled into its evening routines, it is unlikely that Tom had gone to his mother and offered a full account of what had occurred. Men like Tom, charming, social, accustomed to being given the benefit of the doubt, rarely conduct those audits of themselves. The moment had passed. Charlotte had walked away. No scene. And as far as Tom was concerned, probably nothing had happened. That particular brand of obliviousness is its own kind of cruelty. When Camilla did become aware, and she became aware because in that household very little stayed private for long, her response was one of the more quietly revealing moments in this story. She did not go to William. She did not seek out Charlotte. She did not dispatch Tom to offer any kind of acknowledgement. She waited. She managed the information the way the institution had always managed information, by holding it still, not drawing attention to it, hoping that time and routine would smooth the surface back to something that looked like normal. But William had already stopped waiting. And somewhere down a long corridor, Charlotte was learning, too young, too fast, something about the difference between a family that functions and a family that performs. It is a lesson, once learned, that you cannot unlearn. She would carry it forward, so would William, and the shape of the relationships in that household would never be quite the same as the shape they'd had before a small girl rounded a corner at the wrong moment and heard something she was never supposed to hear. The hidden truth was no longer hidden. It was just not yet spoken aloud. That part was still coming. There are conversations in the British royal family that never get recorded, never get leaked, that never get confirmed by any source with a name attached to it. They happen in private rooms between people who understand in their bones that certain things must remain unspoken in order for the whole structure to keep standing. This was going to be one of those conversations. William requested a meeting with his father. Not through an aide, not through the formal scheduling channels that govern most interactions between senior royals. Directly. A call, a brief request, a date set. Charles, who at this point in his reign is perpetually managing the impossible geometry of holding a family together while running an institution, agreed without asking what it was about. He knew his son. He knew the particular frequency of William's silences. He probably already knew, at least in outline, what had happened. The meeting took place away from the official spaces, not in a throne room, not in a meeting room staffed by private secretaries. In a private sitting room, are the kind of room where real things get said because the walls don't have an audience. Charles, now in his mid-70s, has developed in his later years a quality that his younger self famously lacked, the capacity to listen without immediately defending. It cost him something to develop it. Life cost him that quality, specifically over specific decades. William did not go in angry. He had had enough time by then, and to move past the immediate heat of Charlotte's afternoon and into something colder and more considered. What he brought to his father was not a complaint. It was a position. He spoke clearly. He described what had happened. He described what Charlotte had told Kate. He described the pattern, not just the one incident, but the accumulation of small moments over years that had preceded it, the incrementally calibrated edge that Tom's manner carried in private spaces. And then he said the thing that was hardest to say, the thing that required the most from him. He said he would not be putting his children in situations where Tom Parker Bowles was present. Charles listened. This is a moment that requires some understanding of who Charles is, underneath the king. He is a man who has spent his entire life trying to reconcile contradictions that could not actually be reconciled. Duty and desire, institution and individual, past and present. and his marriage to Camilla was, for him, the one thing he had fought for and eventually won, and it had cost him relationships and reputation and decades of his life. Camilla is not peripheral to Charles. She is central in a way that very few people are. And Camilla's children, Tom and Laura, are part of her world in a way that Charles has always respected. What William was asking, in the most precise terms, was for his father to acknowledge that his grandchildren's well-being took precedence over a social arrangement that had always made certain people uncomfortable. Charles did not argue. He did not defend Tom. He did not ask William to reconsider or find a middle ground or exercise patience. He sat with what William had said, and then he said quietly that he understood. 2 words. But they carried the weight of everything Charles had never quite been able to say out loud during all the years of managed family harmony. He understood. What happened next was practical. The social geometry of gatherings, the guest lists for private family events, the quiet, invisible architecture of which people are in which rooms on which occasions, it began to shift. Slowly, without announcement, the way continental plates move, no public statement, no dramatic falling out, no story for the tabloids, just Tom Parker Bowles no longer appearing in certain spaces. Camilla knew. Of course she knew. She is not a woman who misses the mechanics of her own social landscape. She had navigated the most hostile reception any woman in British public life had faced in living memory. Years of being cast as a villain in a story the public had already decided the ending of, and she had done it with enough composure to eventually stand beside her husband at his coronation. As she had not survived all of that by being unaware of how rooms arrange and rearrange themselves. What Camilla felt about it is a question that belongs entirely to her. She has never given a window into her private emotional life in any meaningful way. What can be observed is that her public manner did not change. She continued to be present, composed, performing the role of queen consort with the practiced ease of someone who has been preparing for that role, consciously or not, and for a very long time. But between herself and William, something shifted. Not broke. Shifted. The warmth that had been built carefully over years, the dinners and the small moments and the glacial, deliberate accumulation of family trust, did not disappear. But it took on a new quality. The quality of 2 people who are both very intelligent and very controlled and who have just exchanged a piece of information about where each of them actually stands, without either of them saying a single word about it directly. William had drawn a line, not around himself, around his children. This is the distinction that matters, the one that keeps this story from being a simple tale of old resentment finding new expression. William had spent years absorbing what his position required him to absorb. He had performed the unity. He had posed for the photographs. He had been, by any objective measure, more gracious about the complexities of his family's history than anyone had a right to expect from a man who had been 12 years old when his mother died and had spent the years since navigating the public apotheosis of the woman his mother blamed. He had done all of that, and he had done it because he understood on a level deeper than feeling what the institution required and what his father needed and what it meant to be the man who would one day be king. And he had accepted the cost of all of that, but Charlotte was 9, George was 11, Louis was 6. They had not accepted any cost. They had not agreed to any bargain. They were children in a home that should have been safe, and the protection of that safety was the one thing William would not negotiate, would not perform, would not manage into palatability for the sake of anyone's comfort. There is something in this story that is not really about royalty at all. It is about the moment when a parent realizes that the tolerance they have extended, the patience they have practiced, the compromises they have made, all of it was always conditional on one thing that was never actually stated. And then something happens that makes that condition visible, and everything that came before it gets quietly reorganized in the light of that new clarity. Charlotte, wiping her eyes in a corridor, had done something without knowing she had done it. She had shown her father where the line was. He had drawn it. And for the first time in a very long time, something in William Wales felt less like management and more like solid ground. Charlotte, for her part, did not know any of this was happening. She went to school. She rode her horse. She laughed at her brothers. She did what children are supposed to do. But the adults in her life had received something from her, a kind of clarity, delivered without her intending to deliver it. And they were acting on it in the quiet, invisible ways that royal families act on things. The story was not over. The hidden truth, the thing that had been building under the surface of all those managed photographs and official warmth, was still working its way upward, and it was almost at the surface now. The British royal family has a phrase for what happens when private truth becomes unavoidable. And they call it the situation, not the problem, not the crisis, the situation. It is a word that keeps things at arm's length, that converts the jagged and personal into something administrative, something that can be put on a list and managed with the same tools used to manage a diplomatic schedule or a public appearance. The situation with Harry, the situation with Andrew. And now, in private rooms and whispered conversations, the situation with Tom. But this situation was different from the others in one important way. This one involved Charlotte, and Charlotte was not a situation. She was a child. She was the daughter of the future king. She was a girl who had walked down a corridor on an ordinary afternoon and come home carrying something she should never have been asked to carry. And the fact that her tears had set in motion a quiet restructuring of royal relationships, that her pain had, without anyone planning it, forced a truth to the surface that had been submerged for years, was not something the palace could file away neatly. It had the inconvenient quality of being real. In the months that followed, the public saw very little of what had changed. That is, of course, the point. The machinery of royal public presentation does not show you the fractures. It shows you the smiles at events, the waves from balconies, the carefully composed family photographs where everyone is wearing coordinated colors and the children are doing something endearing. It shows you the surface. But the surface had changed. People who attend the kind of private gatherings that orbit the royal family, the dinners, the weekends, the events that are never photographed and never appear in any newspaper, began to notice, quietly, that the guest list had been reorganized. Tom Parker Bowles was present at events connected to Camilla's world, to Charles's world. He was absent from the events that were William's world. The overlap that had previously existed, the social intersection point where those two circles had met, had simply stopped existing. No announcement, no drama, an absence where a presence used to be. The people who noticed understood what it meant. The people who understood kept it private. And that is how these things work in that world, through a shared comprehension that is never spoken, because speaking it would require acknowledging that something went wrong, and acknowledging that something went wrong is the one thing the institution is structurally incapable of doing cleanly. What it could do, what it was, in fact, doing, was adapt. William, in this period, was also doing something else. Something quieter and more personal than the reorganization of dinner party geometry. And he was talking to his children. Not about the specifics of what had happened. He would not make Charlotte carry the adult version of that story. But William had begun, with a deliberateness that Kate recognized and quietly supported, to speak to his children about the mechanics of their world, about the difference between people who are family by love and people who are family by arrangement, about the fact that in their particular lives, those two things were not always the same thing. And knowing the difference was not a cynical lesson, but a practical one. He told them, in the language of a father rather than a future king, that they were allowed to trust their own instincts about people, that if something felt wrong, it was permitted to feel wrong. that no amount of official warmth or institutionally required civility should override the quiet voice inside that said, "This person is not safe." But Charlotte listened with the particular attention she has always had, the attention of a child who is older than her age in certain specific ways, who absorbs subtext even when the text is carefully managed. She listened, and something in her settled, not fixed, not resolved, settled. There is a difference. And here is the larger truth that Charlotte's afternoon had cracked open, the thing that had been submerged, not for months, but for decades. And under all the management and the performance and the carefully constructed public narrative of a blended royal family that had learned, finally, to function. The Windsor family, at its core, has always been two families operating under one name. There is the family of Charles and his first marriage, William and Harry, the sons of Diana, the children of a love story the public invested in so completely that when it failed, an entire generation grieved. Yet these are men who grew up in the full glare of one of the most scrutinized marriages in history. They watched their mother give an interview that shook the institution. They carried her coffin through London while the world watched. They became, whether they wanted it or not, the living symbols of everything that marriage cost. And then there is the family of Charles and Camilla, a unit built on different foundations, shaped by different pressures, and carrying its own private history of sacrifice and patience and the eventual arrival of public legitimacy. Tom and Laura, Camilla's children, grew up adjacent to that story in a completely different way. They watched their mother villainized and eventually vindicated. They navigated their own complicated relationship to the public narrative. They are not bad people for having done so. But these are not the same experience. They were never the same experience. And the polished machinery of royal family management had spent 20 years trying to present them as a single unified thing, a modern blended family, proof that the institution could adapt, evidence that private pain could be alchemized into public grace. Charlotte's afternoon was the moment when that polishing stopped being sufficient. And because underneath all of it, underneath the official photographs and the managed smiles and the patient performance of unity, there had always been a fault line. The fault line between the family William came from and the family he had been asked to fold himself into. And for years, William had managed that fault line with extraordinary care, because he understood what was at stake and because he was, at his core, a man who believed in the institution he was born to serve. But he was also a father, and the father in him looked at his 9-year-old daughter's face and found that he had run out of management. This is the hidden truth that nobody had wanted to name out loud, not because it was scandalous, it wasn't particularly in the way that so many royal stories are, but because it was simply, quietly, humanly true. And truth of that particular kind, the kind that doesn't have a press release, that can't be reframed by a communications team, and that just sits there being itself, is the kind the palace has always found hardest to absorb. William knows who his family is. He has always known. He has simply been willing, for a long time, to work around the edges of that knowledge for the sake of everything the institution required. He will continue to work around those edges, in most ways, in most contexts. He will stand on the balcony. He will pose for the photographs. He will perform, with practiced grace, or the version of the Windsor family that the public is invited to see. But in the private geography of his life, in the rooms where his children eat their dinner and do their homework and walk down corridors on quiet afternoons, he has drawn a map, and the lines on that map are no longer what they were. Charlotte is still 9 years old. She will grow up surrounded by the extraordinary, exhausting, gilded complexity of the life she was born into. She will learn more as she grows, more about her grandmother Diana, more about the history that shaped her father, more about the mechanics of a world that requires its participants to perform their private pain as public grace. But she already knows something now that she didn't know before that afternoon. She knows what it feels like when a place that is supposed to be safe turns out to have edges. And she knows, because her father made sure she knows, that she is allowed to feel exactly that way about it. That is not a small thing to know. In the long story of this family, in the long, complicated, grief-soaked, magnificent, broken, enduring story of the Windsors, that is not a small thing at all. The tears dried. The truth remained. And William, standing somewhere in a room his mother never got to see, and understood that protecting his daughter from the weight of all of it was the most important thing he had ever been asked to do. He intended to keep doing it,